fascinating stuff.
The subcommittee will come to order. Chairman Abercrombie has been delayed in getting back from Hawaii, so he has asked that I sit in to get the hearing started. Today we will receive testimony from Government Accountability Office and Congressional Research Service witnesses, plus Air Force and Army fighting experts about the airlift and the air refueling aircraft programs. Today's hearing will focus on parts of the Department of Defense recent mobility study and its conclusions which shape the Air Force and Army force structure requirements for air refueling and airlift aircraft. Over the past 10 years, the United States has reduced its Cold War infrastructure and closed 2/3 of its forward bases, yet we have increased our operational tempo of deployments. Our aircraft platforms continue to age without replacement due to procurement shortfalls that began in the last century. We now see the results of these challenges as we look at our aging airlift and the tanker fleets of aircraft. These aircrafts, including even our new strategic airlifter, the C-17, are getting used up far faster than we had planned. In January 2006, the Department of Defense released the Mobility Capability Study, or MCS, and they are currently conducting other airlift and tanker studies. There are many programs and associated issues that we would like to discuss today regarding the C-17, the C-5, the C-130 airlifters, the KCX, the KC-135 tankers, and the Joint Cargo Aircraft. To help us understand the results of the MCS, to give us insight into program issues and the way forward, for recapitalization, and we have two panels of witnesses today. For our first panel, I welcome Mr. Bill Solis, good to see you again, sir, Director of Defense Capabilities and Management of the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Michael Sullivan, Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management of the Government Accountability Office, and Mr. Chris Balcom, Specialist in National Defense from the Congressional Research Service. We want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. But before we begin with witnesses' opening statements, let me call on my good friend, the gentleman from New Jersey and ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Saxton, for any remarks that he would like to state today.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I appreciate you holding this very important hearing on airlift and refueling programs for the Air Force and, of course, for their best customer, the Army. I'm very pleased to be here because I believe the issues we are addressing today are absolutely crucial to the nation's ability to meet our nation's national security strategy. We have several witnesses before the committee today, and they come to us with a tremendous amount of knowledge on these extremely important issues. I'd like to welcome all of you gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it, and I know I speak for myself as well as for Chairman Abercrombie, who is not here, of course. We are here to examine the Department of Defense's airlift and air refueling program requirements. These requirements and capabilities have gaps that vary against a backdrop of ever-changing global security challenges. I'm reminded, Mr. Chairman, of the first time I went to Iraq and was briefed there on airlift capabilities and requirements. We were using C-130s tactically in the country, and as you just mentioned, as the C-130s become less capable because of wear and tear, we have supplemented them with a permanent contingent of 20 C-17s in country to do tactical lift. The programs we are talking about are an enormous part of the defense budget, and for that reason we, the Congress, like to be very sure before we commit to a course of action. Part of being sure is to gather as many facts, study the issue, and to examine all of the alternatives. We first saw a mobility requirement study, MRS-05, in the spring of 2001. That study was designed to tell us how many millions of ton miles per day of cargo capacity we needed to meet our national security strategy. With those conclusions, we could then go about the business of developing a fleet of aircraft to fill that requirement. The problem here, of course, is that MRS-05 was initiated prior to the attacks of 9/11, and was outdated even before it was released. Next, we had the, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the Mobility Capability Study, MCS, started in the summer of 2004. MCS was designed to take a hard look at the nation's airlift requirements as the global war on terror unfolded. Unfortunately, the MCS, at least in my opinion, didn't say much. It validated that we can do the things that we are doing with the assets we have. There were no hard questions asked by the MCS, and there were certainly no answers in MCS. Yet we waited for MCS, hoping that it would steer us in the right direction. Along with MCS, we awaited the QDR to be released. The QDR finally arrived, only to call for 5 more studies related to airlift requirements and provided us little insight into the nation's true airlift capability needs. Today we are waiting for MCS 06 to be released. MCX 06 is designed to incorporate the findings of the 5 other studies called for in the QDR. On top of all these studies, we wait for DoD requirements validations, Nunn-McCurdy certifications, operational test results, and fleet viability reports. We are sitting around, while we were sitting around waiting for these reports, studies, and analysis in a world that is moving much faster than our bureaucracy. We, as a nation and a Congress, are faced with some tough decisions. And everyone I talk to tells me they are waiting on another study before they can answer our questions. While we are waiting for those studies, let me share some facts. The fiscal year 2008 budget request is here. Long lead suppliers for C-17 are being issued stop orders. The line is scheduled to close in 2009, although I received a call last week that said it may close even sooner. The Army, or maybe begun to phase down even sooner. The Army and the Marine Corps are increasing their in-strength by 65,000 personnel, I believe increasing the requirement. The weight of most armored vehicles now required in Iraq precludes the use of C-130 aircraft. We do not know the final weight of the Army's future combat system, nor has it been taken into account in establishing future requirements. The number of IED attacks continues to grow. The one sure way to keep our troops out of that threat is to keep them off the roads. The global war on terror is just that, a global war that is being fought by many nations and many continents. We are faced with several decisions regarding the nation's airlift and tanker requirements. We cannot afford to put off those decisions in order to wait on another report, because as we wait, the world continues to change around us. To be clear, I am not advocating disregarding any of our current policies. I am making one simple point. Reports don't make decisions, leaders make decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Without objection, all witness statements will be entered for the record. Then, Mr. Solis, it's all yours. You can proceed with your opening statement, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Ortiz, Ranking Member Saxton, and members of the subcommittee, pleased to be here to discuss the development of aircraft program requirements and issues related to the acquisition process. Before I review our work concerning DoD's efforts to assess their future mobility needs, allow me to summarize what I'm going to tell you. Good analysis equals good requirements, which support good decision-making. We have spent the last year reviewing DoD's efforts to assess future mobility needs and can state emphatically that this is a very complex process with many moving parts. There are no easy answers to very tough questions. However, we do believe that distinguishing wants from needs starts with good analysis based on good data and modeling. We recently issued our report on high-risk areas in the federal government, which lists DoD acquisition processes as one of the long-standing areas of concern. Acquisition has been on this list since 1990. As we have reported, DoD knows what needs to be done to achieve more successful outcomes, but finds it difficult to apply the necessary discipline and controls or assign much-needed accountability. We have reported in the past that a sound business case for acquisition contains firm requirements, mature technologies, a knowledge-based acquisition strategy, a realistic cost estimate, and sufficient funding. However, we found that many of these elements are missing or incomplete as DoD and the services attempt to acquire new capabilities. Persistent acquisition problems include failure to identify wants or needs versus wants and to limit cost growth, schedule delays, and quantity reductions, but fiscal realities will not allow budgets to accommodate these problems any longer. Today, I'll highlight some of the issues related to the analysis supporting the DoD's mobility capabilities and requirements, and Mike Sullivan will discuss actions that are needed to improve the outcome of weapon system acquisitions. DoD has an obligation to deliver high-quality products to warfighters when they need them at a price the country can afford. However, work shows that acquisition problems will likely persist until DoD provides a better foundation for buying the right things the right way. This foundation begins with setting requirements that are based on adequate and complete analysis using current and operational data and updated and effective models. For the past several years, we reported our concerns with the analysis done to support requirements and have recently issued 2 reports that raise concerns about the quality of analysis underpinning programmatic decisions surrounding the DoD airlift requirements. In September 2006, we issued our report on DoD's mobility capability study, or the MCS. The MCS determined that the projected mobility capabilities are adequate to achieve U.S. objectives with an acceptable level of risk during a period of fiscal years 2007 through 2013. That is, the current U.S. inventory of aircraft, ships, and pre-positioned assets and other capabilities are sufficient in conjunction with host nation support. In our report, we stated that conclusions of the MCS were based on incomplete data, inadequate modeling, and metrics that did not fully measure stress on the transportation system. We further observed that the MCS results were incomplete, unclear, or contingent upon further study, making it difficult to identify findings and evaluate evidence. It's not clear how the analysis was done for the study support DoD's conclusions, and we suggested that decision makers exercise caution in using the results. This week, we issued a report on the lack of mandatory analysis to support a passenger and cargo capability for the new replacement refueling aircraft, the KCX tanker. Contrary to mandatory Air Force implementing guidance, the Air Force proposed a capability without an identified need, a requirement that was not supported by need and not underpinned by analysis. Air Force officials could not provide supporting information sufficient to explain this discrepancy between the required analysis and the proposal. In closing, as I said at the beginning of my testimony, acquisition problems will persist until DoD provides a better foundation for buying the right things the right way. This concludes my oral statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I will now turn to Mike Sullivan for his comments.
Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. Over the last several years, we, the GAO, have examined weapon acquisitions from the perspective of best practices for product development. We found that successful product development programs begin with a sound business case, as Bill was alluding to. Business cases that provide evidence that a product can be developed and produced if it has proven technologies at the outset, there's design knowledge at the right times, and adequate and stable funding is available. And then the business case must be executed through an acquisition process that is anchored in knowledge to reduce risk. Basic systems engineering practices should provide the underpinning for all of this. Without these kind of practices in place, a cascade of negative effects results in cost increases and delays in getting new capability to the warfighter. While DoD has included many of these best practices into its acquisition policies, its programs still often do not follow through on them. The underlying cause for this is the Department's inability to enforce those policies at the programmatic level. Airlift acquisitions are not immune to this and have experienced unnecessary cost growth and schedule delays as a result. In the past 25 years, DoD has invested more than $140 billion on airlift and tanker forces. Between 2007 and 2011, it plans additional investments of nearly $32 billion. Roughly a third of this is planned for 4 ongoing programs under discussion today. These programs include programs to modernize the C-5 and the C-130 avionics systems, re-engine the C-5 aircraft, and develop the C-130 airlifter. All of these programs were considered low technological risks because they relied on proven commercial technology when they began. However, they have not delivered on their original business cases. As a result, each program has encountered some difficulty in moving into production and delivering to the field. Poor results in each program stem at least in part from a failure to use basic systems engineering practices to do three things. First, fully analyze requirements and the resources that are needed to integrate the proven technologies into a military system. Second, begin system demonstration only after you've stabilized the design. And three, demonstrate that the aircraft will work in its intended environment before you make large production investments. The net effect of the problems across all four of these programs is additional unplanned expenditures so far of $962 million and a longer wait than planned for the warfighter to get the equipment delivered to him. For example, the Air Force now expects by 2011 to have completed the modification of about 135 fewer C-130 airlift aircraft when compared to its plan 2 years ago. There could be additional cost increases and schedule delays reported in the near future. The program's current budget indicates that total costs have recently increased almost another $700 million, and planned quantities have been reduced from 434 to 268, nearly doubling the unit costs for the avionics modernization program. The program recently notified Congress of a critical Nunn-McCurdy breach concerning this. I'll conclude by making 5 points. First, DoD will continue to face big challenges in modernizing its forces, especially with the new demands on the federal dollar. Second, the 4 acquisition cases that I cite in this testimony are not atypical, and in fact were not as complex as most major acquisitions. Even with no major technological invention to meet warfighters' needs in these cases, they have achieved suboptimal results in terms of costs and deliveries. Third, there are major consequences to these outcomes. The warfighter does not receive needed capability on time, and the Department and the Congress must spend additional unplanned money to correct mistakes. Fourth, a product development process based in knowledge, steeped in best practices from systems engineering, can solve many of these problems that happen before they start. And finally, and perhaps most important, DoD knows how to do this, and in fact already informs its acquisition policy with systems engineering rules. It should redouble its efforts to enforce these policies on programs by ensuring first that the right mix of programs, given all available resources, is in the mix. Second, establishing sound business cases for each one of those programs. And third, by holding people accountable for better cost, schedule, and performance results as they execute those programs. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Balkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for inviting me to speak with you today about airlift and aerial refueling. As requested, I'll address the potential oversight issues for this and future legislative cycles. First, I'll address the KCX, the Air Force's plan to recapitalize its aging tanker fleet. The Air Force hopes to begin replacing its 500 KC-135 tankers with 179 new aircraft, either the Boeing KC...
If you can get closer to your mic so that we can hear a little better.
Yes, sir. The Air Force hopes to begin replacing its 500 KC-135 tankers with 179 new aircraft, either the Boeing KC-767 or the KC-30, made by Airbus and Northrop Grumman. Media reports have raised concerns that this competition may be biased against Airbus's larger aircraft. After an initial review, CRS found that as DoD defines its tanker requirement, the KCX competition does not appear biased in favor of either aircraft. Another issue is whether the Air Force plan is affordable. In 2006, DoD's tanker analysis of alternatives found that buying new commercial aircraft was the most cost-effective way to initially recapitalize the KC-135 fleet, but that overall affordability was an important consideration. Purchasing new aircraft is more capital-intensive than other options, such as re-engineering KC-135Es, buying used aircraft, and leasing aerial refueling services. The Air Force has consistently objected to these other options and hopes to purchase approximately 350 more new aircraft after KCX. Congress will have future opportunities to examine the efficacy of buying used aircraft or leasing tanker services. However, the Air Force wants to retire its last KC-135E aircraft in FY08. If it's successful, the re-engining option will be moot. The final point on tankers is that the requirement is unclear. DoD's last study on tanker requirements in 2001 is outdated. The 2006 Mobility Capability Study, or MCS, provided guidance on tanker capabilities, but it did not estimate required force size. Further, there's debate among the acquisition community, the mobility community, and the combatant commanders on specific tanker requirements such as airlift capacity. My second subject is long-range airlift. The airlift requirement is also imprecise and can be met in different ways. The MCS found that DoD's airlift programs could meet the national military strategy with moderate or acceptable risk. But these are subjective terms, and a close examination of this classified study and the recent addition of 10 C-17s to the planned inventory could lead many to perceive the risk as actually being low. As the C-17 production line wanes, pressure is building to procure more aircraft. This brings C-17 funding in direct competition with C-5 modernization. Now, there are strong arguments in favor of both programs, but it is not simply an either-or competition. Broader trade-offs exist because more airlift capacity in the tanker fleet could make smaller C-5 or C-17 fleets acceptable. Because the C-17 can perform both long and short-range airlift, it may compete against programs like the C-130 for funding and for mission. Last, I'll address short-range airlift, specifically the C-130 and Joint Cargo Aircraft programs. Again, a number of aircraft are competing for limited funding to satisfy an ambiguous requirement. C-130J procurement competes with the C-17 and with the modernization of older C-130 models. In FY06, for example, DoD proposed terminating the C-130J, in part because modernizing older C-130s was cheaper. Since then, C-130J funding was reinstated, and procurement of 9 aircraft is planned in FY08. Conversely, C-130 modernization programs are now being reduced, as Mike just mentioned. The Joint Cargo Aircraft program is in many ways a shotgun marriage between Army and Air Force programs. There's noteworthy disagreement between the services on how this aircraft would be used. Formally, the Air Force agrees with the Army's initial vision, but is still defining its own final requirements. An issue for Congress is whether the Army could begin acquiring the Joint Cargo Aircraft, only to find that the Air Force's final requirements are not easily met by the aircraft chosen. If this turns out to be the case, it could mean costly retrofits or even the need for a different aircraft. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Balcom. Maybe you can expand a little bit to help us understand the capabilities of both the C-5 and the C-17 aircraft and why they're important to the Air Force inventory. Could you please compare and contrast what advantages both give to the Air Mobility Command in moving cargo and supplies to the warfighter? If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Be happy to, sir. Both airplanes are long-range strategic platforms, and what distinguishes them from commercial carriers such as craft are a number of things, but one of the most important is the ability to carry outsized and oversized cargo like Patriot anti-missile systems, Apache helicopters, and the like. They provide a certain capability that you just can't find anywhere else in that regard. I do note that in an earlier hearing, General Moseley characterized the C-5 as, quote, a little bigger than the C-17. And respectfully, I believe that General Moseley might have misspoken because Air Force planning factors show it's almost twice as big. Depending on what you're carrying, it can carry twice as many larger outsized objects or twice as many pallets. So there's a non-trivial difference between the two in terms of their size. And the final point I'll just make is, although quite capable, the C-5 is limited to large, very prepared runways, whereas the C-17, of course, can do both short-range, austere operations and the longer operations.
My good ranking member, Mr. Saxton.
I think I would like to, Mr. Chairman, I think I would like to yield my time to one of the junior members who may not have had an opportunity to ask his questions in the last hearing.
You want to single anybody out?
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Saxton. I greatly appreciate that. There's a couple things that interest me about the subject matter that you have been testifying about. One is General Mosley and Secretary Wynne have been talking about concerns of the aerospace industry to meet the capacity needs of the Air Force, and it certainly seems that there's inherent in all of our concerns with the acquisition process. The health of the underlying industry's ability to meet our needs is certainly an important one. Do you have any thoughts or comments concerning the aerospace industry's overall capacity in looking at future acquisitions?
I'd be happy to address that, sir. I think that the way you phrased it actually confuses me a little bit, because when I look at the Air Force plans, they're actually planning to purchase fewer aircraft than our industry has the capacity to build. The overcapacity tends to be the problem, not an undercapacity. I didn't hear his testimony, so there are...
Their perspective was in the future, that as we begin the process of turning the spigot off and constraining what we're currently acquiring, that the loss of production capacity can have an impact on our abilities in the future. And certainly, if you look at the issue of the tankers, our acquisition planning for replacement, and then looking at those aircrafts, the amount of time that will expire before all the aircraft are replaced, and what their service would have to be before we then are able to replace them based on the capacity of the aerospace industry, is certainly a very lengthy projection.
Specifically on that, sir, I think you've characterized it correctly. The days of buying 100 aircraft a year are really gone. And so those old models of the industrial government relationships have got to change, and they have changed. And frankly, that's one of the stronger arguments against purchasing just new aircraft. Certainly that's an important part of recapitalizing the fleet, perhaps the foundation. But I agree with that assessment that buying 15, 17, 20 a year or so doesn't recapitalize the fleet very quickly, and still does not reduce the average age of our fleet very quickly.
Well, and therefore then has an impact of reducing the overall capacity of the industry in case we should look to trying to close the gap at a quicker pace or have higher needs.
That would be one approach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to try to see if we can stick to the 5-minute rule, but at the same time give sufficient time for the witnesses to respond to the question, because we do have two panels. This is the first panel, then we have the second panel. Mr. Smith.
I will strive to be quick, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. First of all, I just want to thank you, gentlemen, and the Air Force for their work on the refueling tanker issue. I know that wasn't easy, and I know my hometown company there at one time or another didn't make it easy for you, so I appreciate that process is being moved forward. We've got a decision date, and the project is going forward. I know that wasn't easy. I appreciate your work in that. My question is about on the airlift piece, in terms of what we need to have the airlift between the C-17, the C-5, and the 130s, where you think we're at, what we need to add. And I know there's questions about that. Do we have sufficient airlift now, sufficient plan? What are the major challenges in that area? And second, specific to, not to insert my own subcommittee into this discussion, but I'm chair of the terrorism subcommittee, jurisdiction over special ops. Special ops folks in particular have a need for an updated C-130, and they are, as you know, dependent upon the Air Force for getting that set up to transfer it over to them. If you could give me an update on when that update in the 130 specific to the special ops needs, how that is progressing. So just those two pieces of the question. And forgive me, I don't know which one of you would be best qualified to answer that, but I'll let you figure it out amongst yourselves. Thank you.
I'll take a first crack at it. In terms of the needs, I mean, right now, if you go back and recognizing that there were limitations on the MCS, it didn't indicate that there were any airlift, there was adequate airlift in the inventory to take care of the existing missions. Having said that, there are things that have changed since the MCS with regards to things like pre-positioning of Army equipment that have changed possibly some of those ideas, and also recognizing that there are still studies underway for intra-theater lift. So it's a little muddied at this point as to exactly how much in terms of lift is needed at this point.
Do you have an idea of when we're going to clarify those questions?
Well, the studies are underway. We don't have visibility, that is GAO doesn't have visibility over where those studies are at, but my understanding is that they're underway.
I would add on that subject, sir, I think the larger challenge is to take a holistic view of our airlift needs. And although the MCS was the first sort of comprehensive study by the participants' own admission, it didn't look at the certain aspects of lift. The thing I'd also mention is that we do have an evolving sort of need, and it's questionable how useful oftentimes the metrics are.
Yeah, that's something I've often wondered about is, we do a fabulous study that takes 2 years, and when it's done, it tells you exactly what we needed 2 years ago. And how do we make sure we update that a little bit more quickly? That's obviously a problem throughout the military, but this is an area of it.
So really, it comes down to a comfort level in terms of sort of public policy making. How much risk are you comfortable with? Are you taking a holistic approach, looking at pre-post, FAST lift, and the like? My view, and I'll make this my last comment, is the military is incredibly flexible and creative in terms of satisfying their military challenges, and a shortfall in airlift can be made up with in other ways.
And if my second question, I realize, is better suited for the next panel, unless one of you want to take a stab at it. And I'm not sure I'm going to be here for the next panel, so if not, those of you who are going to be on that, consider that submitted for the record, and just get the answer to my office when you get a chance. But yes.
Just so we understand, I guess, it's something we could probably also get for you. Were you asking about where they are in terms of delivering?
Yes.
For special ops?
Right.
Okay. I don't have a complete answer to that yet, but we could certainly get that and get back to you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Loviando. Who's next? Dr. Gingrich, you have a question, sir?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to address the question to Mr. Balcom. Mr. Balcom, you outlined in your testimony that the C-5A fleet has at least 25 years of life remaining, and investment in the modernization would be recouped for decades. And additionally, current estimates of the per aircraft cost of AMP and RERP combined are 1/3 that of a new C-17. And in fact, as you pointed out, and I'm glad you did this, that the C-5 will actually carry almost twice the payload of a C-17. And I also read in your testimony that we are leasing Russian AN-124 Condor aircraft to carry outsized and oversized cargo in both Operation Enduring Iraqi Freedom because we didn't have enough C-5 availability. And so the DOD is outsourcing missions to Russian aircraft shows us, I think, that C-5 can perform missions that no other aircraft in our fleet can accomplish. Doesn't this make the case that we should be supporting modernization of an aircraft that can perform critical missions no other aircraft can, especially in light of the fact that the C-5 has a 70% service life remaining, and it can be modernized at a fraction of the cost of a new C-17. And again, any one of the three of you can respond to this. In the President's 08 budget, I didn't see any requests for C-17s. In fact, I think we have maybe 10 more than was recommended in the fleet that we really need, something like 190 aircraft. And so I'm just not sure that, you know, we all these studies and everything would suggest that that we need this balance, and yet what we heard from the Secretary and from the Chief sort of contradicted what was in the President's budget for 08. So if you can respond to that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, sir. You know, I couldn't have said it better myself, but as a CRS guy, of course, I'm not going to say that, but I think your summation of the facts were very powerful. The point I just make is the Air Force program of record currently is to modernize all the C-5. So that is their plan. And we have read in the open press that they've experienced some cost growth in RERP, especially that we've heard anecdotally may cause some changes in the program, but that again remains to be seen, is really for the Air Force to bring up.
I guess I would just note that I would probably reinforce that a little bit. The thing that would be troubling right now is the problems that the C-5 RERP has had, and I think they're looking at the cost now. They're going to probably come out with a new cost estimate. There's problems on the program that are going to probably be fairly costly. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind.
Well, maybe when we hear from my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Marshall, we'll find out a little bit more about those costs and the specifics of that, because I know he's extremely knowledgeable about it. But I appreciate it. Any further comments from the GAO? No. Okay. Well, I'll yield back then, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
A lot of pressure on you now, Jim, but your expertise has been called upon and you're up. So, Mr. Marshall.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I don't know whether I need to thank you, Mr. Gingrey. I shouldn't have said anything about you riding up just one flight earlier today. It's better for your health, by the way, to walk those flights of stairs. I do have questions about the C-5A, C-17, and joint cargo aircraft. Had lots of conversations on this subject. If I recall correctly, it was the Institute for Defense Analysis that, at the request of the Senate, concluded in 2002, after a lengthy study, that the RERP AMP for C-5A, C-5B made absolute sense, and they considered all different configurations that we might go with. And I'm not sure whether it's IDA or some other group, but the study was quite clear, and it wasn't a close call. And so we decided to go ahead and do that. I now hear Air Force saying, Lockheed, the costs are going up unacceptably here, and the dynamic is changing, and the costs may get to a point where it's no longer cost effective to consider RERPing and amping these C-5As. I've suggested to Lockheed that Lockheed lock in a price. I don't see any reason why Lockheed can't do that, and frankly would advise Lockheed, if it wants to have this business, to go ahead and do it, rather than keep up in the air the question concerning how much cost we're going to incur. In talking with the Air Force, I understand there are 29 or 31 C-5, well, all but 2 of which are C-5As, 2 C-5Bs, that Air Force simply considers to be, as Chief Mosley describes it, hard broke. Are you gentlemen familiar with that? I know we've torn down, you're not, okay. We've torn down a C-5A and concluded that its frame was good to go for quite some time, which would justify the RERP AMP investment, and the Fleet Viability Board has said the C-5As are good to go. But we just need to hear more about those that have been specifically identified as ones that should be retired. So it's a twofold thing here. It's not retire all the C-5As, but there are some that just seem to be so broken that it doesn't make much sense to fix them. They'd like permission to retire those. We need to know more about that. And then the second thing is this quandary we're in with regard to rising costs and inability, apparently, to manage the program as well as it needs to be managed. Where KCX is concerned, are any of you gentlemen involved at all in the process of thinking through how in the acquisition process we get an agreement from the OEM that's appropriate so that we know how sustainment, modernization, maintenance is going to occur over the lifetime, the projected lifetime of the platform? Are you involved at all in any of that? No. If you're not, just say no.
Yes,
we'll
sir.
go to the next panel. Okay. Let me try one more here.
Okay.
JCA.
If I could, I mean, we look at acquisitions of the major weapon systems, something like the C-17 program, for example, and in doing so, we're focused mostly on what it takes to develop and then procure the aircrafts, but there's also, especially in the past, 10 years or so, this idea of performance-based logistics, which has become very important. That the department and the services have tried much harder to make the life cycle cost part of the cost of acquiring, the total ownership costs more important at the time they're acquiring.
Yeah, Mr. Sullivan, I don't really think it's just in the last 10 years kind of phenomenon. I think historically, while we might not have taken that into account, it was simply assumed that we, the government, would be in control of the long-term maintenance, sustainment, and modernization process for everything we bought militarily. It was all ours. We got all the data rights. You didn't have to go back to the OEM for anything, and you began immediately developing the management process that you needed in order to logistically take care of the platform over a long period of time.
Yes,
we quit doing that, and probably the most glaring example of our failure in that regard, to the detriment of the Air Force, the detriment of DOD, and the American taxpayer, is the C-17. And we've got a real problem with the C-17 because we didn't think that through at that time, and we don't know how over the long haul we're going to wind up, what sort of partnership we'll develop that will enable us to, in a cost-effective way, deal with that platform. It was a real mistake, and I'm just hoping that we get to a point. I think that KCX is our opportunity to set a model that makes sense in the long run, and that's why I bring that up.
If what you're discussing is kind of is organic capability versus contractor-based capability,
it's more basic than that. Yes, that's true, but it's more basic than that. We buy these things without taking into account what they're going to cost over the long haul and the kinds of understandings we need to have up front that will help us with cost over the long haul. We buy them cheaper to start out with, but in the long run, if you discount the present value of what's going to cost us, we're spending more than we should. May I, Mr. Chairman, I can...
I'd just like to say, Congressman, I think I'm exactly with you there, and what I was trying to say, I guess, is there's ways to develop, there's ways to build in reduced total ownership costs or life cycle costs when you acquire a weapon system during RDT&E.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to have a second round?
Well, we have another panel, but I think that if we move fast enough, we will have
quick
a second round.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My good friend from Michigan, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief as well, knowing we have another panel, and perhaps this question is better suited for the second panel. But let me ask you, gentlemen, if you have any comment, since you're in the business there, about how the Air Force and the Army is coordinating as they look to the future in regards to strategic airlifts, and specifically how are they looking to accommodate future combat systems, for instance, that is really the Army's future there, and being able to strategically airlift those kinds of vehicles and that. Do you see good coordination amongst the groups there? Could you comment on that?
I could comment briefly on what the joint combat aircraft, I think, would be the best example right now of where we see the Army and the Air Force having to come together now to collaborate a little bit more and see if they can get synergies out of the requirements process. And I think you'd have to give them an incomplete grade at this point because the process has really just gotten started. I think they just stood up a joint program office and some joint requirement setting mechanisms to see, how well they can work together. So it's kind of in its infancy in that regard.
Okay. One follow-up question as well for Mr. Bolcom from CRS. You mentioned about that you thought there was a quite a bit of resistance about the possibility of leasing for refueling. Could you flesh that out just a little bit about how much resistance you think there is to that kind of a thing, and if that really is an appropriate way for us to go?
Ma'am, I base my observations on sort of ongoing relationships with the Air Force at many different levels. Their stated position is that there is a Part B to the RFP, the request for proposal, and they will examine, they'll conduct a business case analysis to look into this to see if it's worth doing, and then submit an RFP for air refueling services. That's their position. So it sounds like they are taking it under consideration. I think if you look at the proposed business case analysis, the study design seemed to contain a number of assumptions that might not have been favorable to fee-for-service compared to other options. So that raised some questions in my mind. And just my continued interaction with Air Force staff has kind of raised a question mark. What's happened to it? The BCA was supposed to have been completed. I don't know who's doing it, its status, if one even exists. So I think it's up to the Air Force to document whether they're pursuing it or not.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
Joint cargo aircraft, I'm not as sanguine as you are, Mr. Sullivan, about the current status of the development of that. I almost feel as if I'm an emissary between the parties at this point, listening to both sides, you know, and their worries about, you know, our Air Force's worries about what Army's going to do, and Army's worries about Air Force what is going to do. And I'm wondering what advice, and if y'all can't do this, if this is beyond your ken, fine with me. Don't try and answer. But what advice do you have to us? Is it Congress? Is it who in DOD? I mean, who pulls these folks together and tries to make sure that they're on the same page, or at least if they can be gotten on the same page, get them on the same page?
Well, one of the things that we look at when we look at the major acquisitions is the joint capability requirements process that the department has tried to put in place. In some sense, trying to go more towards functional capabilities in a way to set requirements as opposed to across the services or platforms, if you will. And I think that's, you know, the department has worked very hard to try to institute those policies. There are cultural problems with that. There's stovepiping and things like that. But that, we've reported quite a bit on some of the failings of that process, some of the ways that process and the funding process, for example, mechanically don't link up, so it makes it more difficult for these services to come together.
What worries me is that Army's about to make a decision, and that the decision made by Army will be one that Air Force will conclude it can't live with at some point down the future. And seems to me that there ought to be some mechanism for Congress or DOD or some other group to come in and stop the stovepiping and the cultural problem between the two services. And if there is, in fact, some legitimate reason why there needs to be two different platforms, fine, so be it. It's going to cost us a lot of money to do that. It's not smart economically, but maybe we have to live with it. If, in fact, there's not a good reason, we ought to force them together. How do we force them together? I understand the problem. How do we force them together? Who does that?
If you're asking me mechanically, how would that operate in the department? I think that's there is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions. Probably would be the right position to,
Would it be
get
that maybe
up
this
above.
subcommittee that has a hearing, say, don't do this, fellas, then you come to us and explain why you can't do this jointly?
This subcommittee certainly has a stake in them, developing doable and efficient requirements that can take advantage of the synergies across the services. It certainly does. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand that you gentlemen are try to give us an overview perspective on the planning, particularly in some of these larger kinds of systems. And the line of questioning is, I want to stay on where we have been, which is particularly airlift capacity. And I guess my first question is, do you know if the Air Force or the Air Mobility Command, have they, when they're trying to lay out their requirements, have they been preparing for new and future systems that have to be lifted to combat zones? Has that been specifically built into their numbers? Maybe that's for the second panel. I don't know if you know that. The second question I have for you is, it seems from what we've seen in the last number of years in Iraq that there's going to be a trend to go to more armor on almost everything that we're hauling people around with. Maybe at the point of making that case would be the mine-resistant ambush protected, or MRAPs, the 4,000 that the Marines are going to be using, and it's probably quite possible that the Army may be moving into more of those too, which is a time, 1.5 times the weight of an up-armored Humvee. And then in my district, we're doing a lot of the engineering work on future combat systems. And the idea was going to kind of keep it really light, but as you design it, it's coming out almost a little too big a bite for a C-130. So I guess my question is the trend that we see partly projected because of Iraq, is that going to be typical for military vehicles, that they're going to be heavier? And if that's the case, is the Air Force doing the planning needed to realize that we're going to have to be lifting heavier loads into these combat zones wherever we end up fighting?
Sir, I'll say I don't believe it's a truism that all our ground equipment is always going to be heavier. Certainly that we have a data point where fighting an insurgency in this context, in this environment, where the roadside bombs are a very effective tool, then yes, in this case, we need more armor, but we don't know that's always going to be the case. And I'll just mention, I think that I've witnessed very clear communication between Air Force and Army, both directions. The Army is designing vehicles to fit on particular aircraft, and the Air Force is considering what the Army is working on. So I see appropriate interaction.
I think it depends on the particular, not so much on the vehicle per se, although that certainly is a consideration, but the operational scenarios that they're planning for the future that would probably dictate more about what the aircraft and the lift requirements are going to be into the future. One of the problems, if you go back to Stryker, for example, now this was intra-theater, there was the requirement that the Chief of Staff of the Army laid out at one time to move that brigade anywhere in the world 96 hours. Noble goal, but then trying to figure out how to do that became very problematic, both strategically intra-theater, given some of the weight of the Stryker and just what they were trying to do and the number of assets, both C-5 and C-17, that you'd have to employ to do that. The other thing, for example, with the Stryker too, and you notice all the Strykers in Iraq have the slat armor, you're going to almost probably need 2 aircraft, say C-130s, to move that, because you can't necessarily put all that armor on that aircraft. So again, it probably depends on the particular scenarios and how you're going to operate and what you're going to do into the future.
So you're saying it sounds like all depends is your answer. But somehow or other, I have a hard time visualizing that we're going to send a whole lot of Humvees that don't have any armor on them anywhere where we get in trouble in the world. So, but you're saying, no, we may just be sending all these very light pieces of equipment over.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that your airlift requirement may be dictated by that very thing that you're saying, Congressman, is that if we are going to have, for example, as I said with the Stryker, if you're going to be moving the Stryker and the armor and everything else, the people that go with it, you may need more aircraft, depending on the operational scenarios and the requirements that are laid out.
That's what common sense seemed to dictate to me, but I know you can sometimes look at one war and just plan everything based on one scenario and things can change, but still I'm having a hard time seeing where future combat systems seems to be going. I'm having a hard time seeing that we're getting lighter somehow. No, it's true they're not battle tanks, but still, just because of the physical size as well as the weight, that's what I'm curious about. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Saxton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Solis, you brought up an interesting subject that I lived through. That was the
I know you and I talked about this at one time.
Oh, did we?
Yes.
Okay.
I think
Well,
it's the same question I think you're going to ask.
Well, let me go to the next chapter then. With regard to future combat system and deployment, I believe the concept, once again, is to deploy a brigade quickly with airlift. My understanding, however, is that in carrying out the mobility requirement study as well as the MCS, that the Army has not come up on the net yet to put the requirement forward for the Air Force to meet that deployment, and that therefore conclusions that were drawn about how much airlift we need in terms of C-5 or C-17, whichever, were made in the absence of that requirement. Is that true, and do you see that as a problem?
Congressman, I don't know. I can't answer specifically. What I would note, again, is that, for example, the study on intra-theater lift is still ongoing. I don't know what the results of that may be, but obviously, as I mentioned with the Stryker, that was a big issue. How are you going to move those vehicles within theater? Are you going to do that by, in the case of C-130, going back to what I know, the Stryker, or are you going to start moving it by other aircraft such as C-17? But I don't have, I don't know if we have any, no. I can't answer specifically, but if you would like to, we could probably take it for the record.
Yeah, do you know if the Stryker would fit on a C-130 with a slat armor on it?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so either. All right. My great friend Jim Marshall and my other great friend Mr. Gingrey talked a little about the C-5 and its attributes, and I agree that it is a great platform. And as I listened to Mr. Balcom and his analysis, he talked about the size and its capability of carrying twice as much as a C-17. And I just wanted to point out that, and I'm sure this makes a difference, I just wanted to point out that there's a reason that the Air Force didn't build another great big airplane like the C-5. And that was that the number of times that we fly it fully loaded is really small. Very few times do we fly that airplane fully loaded. And so when they went out to design the airplane that they thought they needed that could land in a short runway and take off in a short runway and carry a heavy load, they thought that the C-5 fit the bill better than the C-17. And there's something to be said for having more tails that carry a partial load. And so I think we have to be very careful of saying that the C-5 is the ultimate airplane because it can carry almost twice as much as a C-17. Would you agree?
Yeah, sir, I think that's very fair. I think the DoD's transportation system is really elegant. You know, if you look at the layers of craft, the C-5, the C-17, they're very complementary. So I think that's a very fair statement.
Okay, thanks. Now, let me just throw something else out. The C-5 modernization program is a good program, and I, here in this committee, helped to put it in place and promote it. And I think it makes sense in some respect, but I'm not sure that it makes sense in fully modernizing both the C-5A and the C-5B. And here's why. In order to modernize the C-5A, you start from a baseline of a mission capability rate of 49.3% today, and that's going down. You start with a fleet availability rate of 35.5% for C-5As. That means, I think in layman's terms, that they have a lot of problems to fix. And so this committee some years ago, actually initiated by the Senate, as Mr. Marshall pointed out, said that we should do a test run on one bird, one C-5A, and that's in the process of being done. So I guess my question is, what needs to be done to correct the problems that have these low mission capability rates? And incidentally, the C-17 has a mission capability rate of 86.8%, not 49%. So my question is, what needs to be done to the C-5A to correct the problems that result in a 49% mission capability rate and a 35% fleet capability rate? And how much does it cost? And finally, how does that relate to the tripwire in Nunn-McCurdy?
The C5M, which will be the version that's amped and RERPed, is estimated to be 85% mission capable. I think that is, by comparison to most aircraft, reasonable and effective. So I think the answer to your first question is amp and RERP, if it works the way they'd like it to work. That should make it as available as you're going to make it. In terms of the tripwire of Nunn-McCurdy, I guess, sir, I really don't know how to answer that. You know, you've got a tripwire of, what is it, 50% cost growth over the, or 15% over the initial baseline. You know, I don't know where RERP is.
And they haven't come up with a final cost estimate, but I understand it's likely to trip Nunn-McCurdy, and that will set in motion a whole set of new requirements.
Yes, sir. And I will just say in conclusion that, you know, those laws and thresholds are there for a reason. That sort of cost growth is of concern. I'll also note that the Air Force is very supportive of some programs that have 200, even 300% cost growth. Those might be different cases, but those are some data points for you in terms of. Well,
here I think when we get to this tripwire, we have the responsibility here of making a decision. If we have the opportunity, if we don't let the C-17 line go down, we then have the opportunity to say, based on the cost as a result that resulted from the test of the C-5A rebuild, do we want to decide to buy new airplanes or amp and RUP C-5s? And I think that's a decision point that we need to come to. Would that make
Agree,
sense
sir.
to you?
That is a trade-off one can make.
I guess I would add there, I think the redone cost estimate for the C5 RERP we're talking about here should be available probably in the June-July timeframe. So that's when we should know that. And the cost could be pretty high.
Mr. Chairman?
When you say the cost could be pretty high, can you elaborate on that?
Some of the indications we've had is if some of the problems they're having with touch labor on the program, for example, I think the thrust reverser problems they've had, designs like that, they are looking at that now, and it looks like there's going to be a lot more engineering effort needed to redesign that. It could be fairly substantial. Nunn-McCurdy breach kind of numbers, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Spratt.
The C-5A experienced significant problems fairly early in its life with wing damage, interior wing damage, which had been indicated when the plane was being constructed at Lockheed, Georgia, because the dynamic testing before the plane was operational showed up damages in the spars and struts inside the wing. And then later the wing had to be replaced at a cost of about $2 billion, rebuilt for the C-5A. In assessing the viable life, future life, is given the stress that the wings have to bear, has any study been made of the wings, or General Mosley mentioned that there were certain bad apples that they wanted to get rid of. Is there a particular set of problems that this airplane has experienced that needs to be addressed? I mean, are they still having structural problems with the wings, the old C-5As, do you know?
Sir, I don't have a specific answer. I think right now the authoritative study on the C-5 is the Air Force's own Fleet Viability Board. I don't recall seeing any mention of bad apples in that report, but I'd be happy to look at it more closely and get back to you.
How many C-5As are operational today?
Operational. Well, we have 60 in the inventory, sir. I don't know how many.
60?
Yes, sir.
There were 81 originally contracted to be built. One burned up on the runway at Lockheed, Georgia. One crashed at Tonsanute, and a couple of others were lost at other means. That means there are about 20 that have been retired.
Sounds about right, sir.
Do you have any idea as to why those 20 were retired as an indication of what's problematic about the airplane? Let me ask you this. Has anybody considered possibly keeping the good, still viable C-5s, but putting them in a system where they'd be utilized a lot less, so that you would have this airlift capacity when and if needed, but you wouldn't fly this airplane, which is otherwise operationally much more expensive to fly than the C-17, particularly if it is not fully loaded?
I haven't heard of such an idea, sir. One challenge maybe is that you have air crews that need to fly these, and they need to get certain hours in and training and experience. And so, any movement in the number of airplanes or how they're used tends to have a ripple effect through the force that you'd have to wrestle with. But I want to just point out there are a number of trade-offs we can make in our larger system, as I said. It's a very elegant system of craft and other capabilities. And so certainly some reduction in C-5s is one of the trade-offs you can make.
It has a unique capacity to carry outsized equipment. Is there anything that it can carry that the C-17 can't carry in smaller loads?
Yes, sir. There's a list of things. An engineering bridge comes to mind. Maybe the most significant is a Special Operations Force, a SEAL boat that the C-17 cannot carry, and the others escape me.
Thank you very much.
I want to ask the panel, the members here, that we are going to have one 15-minute vote and then followed by 3 5-minute votes. It's going to take us at least 25 to 30 minutes before we come back. If we have any questions from these witnesses, do you all have any questions? If not, we can dismiss them so that we can get ready for the second panel. Is that okay? And if you all have any questions, or some of the members who are not here, we'll give them time to submit some of the questions to you in writing. Thank you so much. You've made good statements, and you answer our questions. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
When we come back, we'll be ready for the second panel. Thank you.